G'day crew. If you saw my last on-water video, you'll know that I had to cut the trip short because of a leak in my hydraulic steering. Once I got home, it wasn't hard to establish that the problem was a leaking hydraulic ram on the engine. I thought a video about repairing it might be of interest to some of you in case you have something similar happen. The repair isn't difficult, but you do need a couple of things for it. First and foremost, you need to purchase a seal kit and a bleed kit. I got both from eBay because the bleed kit was a bit cheaper and I was buying from eBay anyway, but the seal kit was way cheaper than buying one locally. So I thought I'd get it off eBay and give it a go. I'll put some links down in the video description in case you need to buy any yourself. You don't need much by way of tools. You'll want a socket set or a set of ring spanners, a set of Allen keys, a hammer, and a length of 2x1 pine. Pretty much covers it. I did do this a little bit back the front, but where I can't edit the video and put things in the right sequence, I will point out where I went wrong, why I went wrong, and the right way to do it. The first thing to do is to take the spanner that comes with the seal kit and loosen the seal on both ends of the cylinder. I knew I needed to do this, but I just got carried away with doing the video while I was doing the job and forgot all about it. It wasn't until I'd taken the ram off that I realised I hadn't undone the ends of the cylinders. It just made it a little bit more difficult to do, but not impossible. And once you've loosened the seals, remove the nuts holding the ram to the brackets and the brackets to the engine. You need to undo both of these nuts. This is on the port side of the engine, at least in my installation. And on the starboard side of the engine you need to undo these two nuts. Be careful of the wire, that's your earth wire. It's very important that you have all that connected, so make sure you don't break it. It does have a tendency to twist if you don't hold it as you do the nuts up or undo them. And next, loosen that collar on the starboard side of the engine so that you can remove the ram. I didn't get this very well in the original video, so I'm just taking another shot of it. This little collar thing here, you need an Allen key to get into that. The nut's captive, so you don't seem to need to hold that. The Allen key's enough to undo it, but you do need to loosen this collar. You don't need to take it off or anything, but just loosen it up. And that lets you push the shaft back through that way, as you see me doing in a second. If you have a wheel puller, then great, use that. You can buy a seal kit that comes complete with a wheel puller to pull the bracket off, but I didn't. I cheapskated out of it and I'm doing it this way. I used that piece of pine wood I mentioned to absorb the jarring so it wouldn't damage the engine, and I used a baby sledgehammer. If you're going to do it the way I have, then the pine wood is mandatory. Otherwise you'll most likely break something important. Now, even if you're a little bit clumsy using the pine wood, you can still break things, so be very careful. You'll also find that a heavy hammer, something that's worthy of Tim the Toolman, makes a job much easier. And when it came time to remove the end caps, I used an old ice cream bucket to catch most of the oil. Now, don't deny I am a cheapskate, but personally I wouldn't reuse that oil. It may be contaminated by the time you're finished. I just caught it in the ice cream bucket to reduce the mess that I would have to clean up afterwards. And when I examined the shaft, at first I didn't see any damage to it, but after I cleaned it up and run my thumbnail along it, I could feel that there were some marks on it. I called them scratches in the video where I talk about them, but in fact it was actual pitting. By the time I'd finished going over it, I was pretty amazed at the amount of pitting there was on the shaft. I did not expect that at all. I had thought that the seals had just worn out, or perhaps something had knocked the shaft and put a little dent in it, and that had ripped out one of the seals. But it wasn't that. The pitting probably did the damage, but there was way more than I expected. But the actual pitting wasn't as, how will I put it? There wasn't as much damage to the shaft. I thought there might have been a bigger dent in it. with a raised lip or something to cause the damage to the seals, but I didn't see that at all. Now, as I just said, I had to run my thumbnail along the shaft to find where the pitting was, but once I'd located it, it was easy enough to see. I couldn't detect any raised bits, but the pits did have a sort of sharpish edge, so maybe that was what did the damage. I did try to get a close-up of one, but it didn't come out. If you've ever seen rust pits in iron, then it was like that, only on a tiny scale and without any rust. I'm not sure what would have caused the pitting because the shaft sits in oil all the time. It appears to be a good quality 316 stainless steel, so rust pitting can be ruled out in any case. Nevertheless, there were quite a few pitted areas along the shaft. Now, generally speaking, the seal around a hydraulic shaft, like we've got here, can function with variations in diameter and roundness, so long as they are smooth and relatively minor. Now, given the expense of replacing the shaft, and with that in mind, I decided to gently sand out the pits with 1600 grit wet and dry sandpaper. Using 1600 grit sandpaper would be a slow job, but it would maintain an acceptably smooth finish. I could have used a rougher paper to take it down quicker and then used the finer paper to smooth the finish off, but shortcuts like that can be fatal to the job. You can end up taking too much off inadvertently, for instance. So I decided to play it safe and take however long it took to do it the slow way. In the finish, it took me about 3 hours to sand out all those pits. I didn't get them quite 100% removed, but I think I made them smooth enough not to damage the seals. Now, with the shaft repaired, it's just a matter of putting it back together again in the reverse order. Doing this, don't forget to use this to protect the seals as you slide them over the rod. Just putting a bit of this stuff on the shaft here. It'll come off again next time I need to get it off, which I hope is never. That's the kit for bleeding the steering. There's oil, I leave the oil in that bleeder tube. It's got a couple of fittings like on a hose, like a garden hose fitting. They just clip onto the bleeding nipples, and you put one on each nipple, and that lets the oil flow backwards and forwards, gets rid of all the air. Much easier than trying to bleed it any other way. It's well worth buying this, but if you do buy it, I cheaped out and I got the one with the plastic fittings for putting it on the steering end, metal fittings on the engine end, but I got the plastic fittings because it was a bit cheaper. Don't do that. Get the metal fittings all round, it's well worth it. The plastic fittings are a pain. And once it's back together again, you need your bleeding kit to get the air out of the system. Otherwise it's just not going to work anyway. Now, bleeding the air out with that kit is really quite simple. Attach the bleed hose between the two bleed nipples on the hydraulic ram and loosen the nipples. And attaching them is so simple, it's just like attaching a garden hose to clip it onto the tap. Then jump in the boat and screw the male fitting into the filler hole at the steering wheel housing. Screw the bottle of hydraulic fluid to the other end of the tube and invert it so the oil runs down into the steering housing. Just check that you don't have any leaks in that. Start turning the steering wheel backwards and forwards to clear the air from the system. I find it best to turn the wheel several turns at a time each way. Check the tube attached to the hydraulic ram from time to time. When you can no longer see any air in the tube attached to the ram, then the system is supposed to be bled. But air and hydraulics just don't mix, so I keep going for a bit more to make absolutely certain. When you remove the tube from the steering housing, make sure you've got a rag ready to catch any drips. Tighten the nipples on the hydraulic ram before removing the bleed tube. And that should be that. It also remains to be seen that I didn't remove too much material that the seals don't quite work. I'm pretty confident on both counts. Or perhaps I should say, pretty hopeful. I've had it out on the water once since the repair and everything seems fine. Steering works fine, autopilot works fine. But time will tell. My next video is going to be out on the water, and the one after that I will try to get back to the sonar series that I was working on. Thank you for your patience on that one. Until then, good fishing.